Tonight we begin with a development that United States officials had feared, Western allies had quietly prepared for, and intelligence analysts had tracked for weeks, a move that unfolded not over months of diplomatic breakdown, but in a matter of hours. Hours that changed the calculus of this conflict, hours that forced the State Department into emergency session, hours that reminded the world just how dangerous Vladimir Putin remains. What Putin did today crossed a line that the international community had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Volodymyr Zelensky did not hesitate. He responded with clarity, with determination, and with a call for unity that echoed across every Allied capital from Washington to Warsaw. This is not just another chapter in the ongoing war. This is an inflection point. And tonight we break down exactly what happened, why it matters, and what comes next. Section B, background tension. For several weeks now, there have been signals, not official Russian statements, not Kremlin press releases, just signals that Moscow was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain logic, a rhythm, almost a predictability. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and across NATO capitals this week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence officials who monitor Russian military activity know the indicators, the positioning of strategic assets, the movement of command personnel, the unusual communications between military districts, the sudden shift in propaganda messaging. All of that went quiet. The usual chest thumping from Russian state media, the threats, the nuclear posturing, the warnings to the West, all of it went quiet. And whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Senior officials at the Pentagon had been tracking unusual movements near Ukraine's northern border for days. Satellite imagery showed repositioning of artillery units. Electronic warfare signatures suggested new jamming equipment being deployed. But the silence from Moscow was what truly concerned them, because Putin's playbook has always been the same: loud threats followed by quiet action. When the threats stop, the action begins, and that's exactly what happened. Section C, the revelation. Early this morning, American intelligence detected what they described as a significant escalatory posture shift, including the deployment of advanced missile systems that had not been activated in the Ukrainian theater in over 18 months. These are the kinds of weapons that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: preparation for a major offensive, a warning to NATO about direct intervention, or an attempt to fundamentally change the battlefield equation. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his strategic posture, and when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, the State Department pays attention. Multiple sources confirmed to Western media that Russia had moved hypersonic missile carriers to forward positions. These are the Kinzhal-equipped aircraft that Putin has repeatedly described as invincible. But that wasn't all. Reports also indicated movement of Iskander-M systems closer to the front lines, tactical ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear or conventional warheads. The message was unmistakable. Putin wanted the world to see this. He wanted Ukraine to see this. And most importantly, he wanted Washington to see this. Section D, the warning response. The warning issued by the State Department tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Officials, after emergency briefings, described Putin's move as reckless destabilizing and, perhaps most importantly, inconsistent with any genuine interest in diplomatic resolution. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller stood before cameras with a gravity that Washington watchers immediately recognized. This was not a prepared statement for a minor incident. This was a carefully calibrated message designed to reach Moscow directly, but intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Zelensky did not. In fact, his response today was among the most defiant and unifying we've seen since the early days of the invasion. Here's what we know. Within 3 hours of Putin's escalation becoming public, Zelensky convened an emergency session of his National Security and Defense Council. These weren't the routine weekly briefings. These were crisis protocols, procedures that Ukraine only activates when they are preparing to respond to existential level threats. And respond they did. Ukrainian forces launched a coordinated series of strikes against Russian military infrastructure in occupied territories, targeting the very systems that were being moved into position. Section E, detailed breakdown tonight. Ukrainian military command confirmed that their forces launched precision strikes on multiple high-value Russian targets, including a command center in occupied Luhansk that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was coordination of the new offensive preparations. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate. They hit ammunition depots, they hit fuel storage facilities, they hit logistics hubs that were likely preparing to support any renewed Russian push. In other words, Ukraine targeted the infrastructure of escalation, the supply chain that would have made Putin's posture shift operational. This is what made the State Department's warning so urgent. Putin's move wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of shift that could fundamentally alter the battlefield if left unchecked. And Zelensky, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. Ukraine didn't waste resources on symbolic targets. They didn't spread their strikes thin across meaningless positions. They hit the nervous system of Russia's escalation. They hit the logistics that would have made it possible. Ukrainian officials reported that within the first 12 hours of their response, they had successfully degraded multiple Russian command and control nodes. Electronic warfare capabilities were disrupted. Communication lines between forward units and rear command were severed. This was not panic. This was precision, and it sent a message to Moscow that Ukraine will not be intimidated into submission. Section F, deeper analysis, and here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western analysts now believe that Putin's latest move was designed to test the resolve of the alliance after months of political uncertainty in Washington and fragmentation in European capitals. Putin wanted to see whether NATO would waver, whether the United States, distracted by domestic concerns, would slow-walk its response, whether European nations facing economic pressures would begin to crack. But instead, the opposite happened. The State Department didn't hesitate. They issued a condemnation that was so immediate, so unequivocal, that even Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, the West did. Intelligence officials speaking with major outlets under anonymity described Putin's shift as coercive escalation, a way to pressure Ukraine and its allies into accepting a frozen conflict on Russian terms. But Zelensky proved today that Ukraine remains both capable and willing. Strikes were not only militarily effective, they were timed so precisely that Russian forces had no opportunity to disperse or relocate the targeted assets. That precision matters because it shows intelligence coordination is working. It shows that Ukraine is not merely reacting to Russian moves, they are anticipating them. They are staying one step ahead. And that is something Putin did not expect. Section G, scale and scope. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian air defense forces successfully intercepted multiple incoming Russian missiles, forcing Moscow to expend expensive precision munitions with minimal effect. Ground forces targeted Russian electronic warfare installations that had been deployed in the last 72 hours. Naval drones operating in the Black Sea reportedly struck supply vessels used by Russia to reinforce positions in occupied Crimea. This wasn't just defense, this wasn't just resilience, this was strategic counter-escalation. This was sending a message. And sending messages is the one thing Putin has struggled to monopolize since this war began. For every advance Russia has made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates Moscow's calculations. For every show of force from the Kremlin, Kyiv has demonstrated that force alone cannot break Ukrainian resistance. Tonight was no different. In fact, tonight may have been the clearest demonstration yet that Ukraine's military capabilities have not only held, they have grown. Section H, historical context. Remember, Putin thought this war would last 3 days. He thought Kyiv would fall within the first week. He thought the West would fracture after the first round of sanctions. He thought European dependence on Russian energy would force capitulation. He thought Ukraine would negotiate from weakness within months. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is striking deeper into Russian-held territory than ever before. Western support, while tested, remains fundamentally intact. NATO is more unified than it has been in decades, and Zelensky stands before his nation not as a leader on the brink of defeat, but as a symbol of resistance that has inspired the world. Putin's assumptions have been wrong at every turn, and tonight his latest gamble appears to be following the same pattern. Section 1, stakes and pressure. What makes this moment so dangerous and so consequential is that Putin's latest move happened at a time when he is under immense internal pressure. Russian military hardliners want faster results on the battlefield. Oligarchs want the economic pain to ease. The Russian public wants to understand why their sons are dying in a war that was supposed to be over years ago. Western intelligence agencies want to see cracks in the Kremlin's facade. Putin is balancing these demands while facing a military situation that refuses to go according to plan. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability. The escalation we saw today wasn't the move of a confident leader with a winning strategy. It was the move of a leader trying to change the narrative, trying to project strength he may not actually possess, trying to intimidate an adversary that has repeatedly refused to be intimidated. Section J, official response to the State Department's warning, now distributed through diplomatic channels worldwide, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow Russian nuclear coercion to succeed. Officials said plainly that Putin's repositioning of strategic assets was inconsistent with responsible nuclear stewardship. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and there will be consequences. You don't usually hear that tone from Foggy Bottom unless something serious is at stake. The statement went further, explicitly linking American support for Ukraine to the defense of the rules-based international order. This was not just about Ukraine, this was about what kind of world we live in, whether nuclear-armed nations can threaten their neighbors into submission, whether borders can be changed by force, whether the international community will stand by and watch or stand up and respond. Tonight, the State Department made clear which side America is on. Section K, leader's speech. Meanwhile, Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a measured, resolute speech tonight. He said, "We have faced this kind of intimidation before. We faced it when they said we would fall in 3 days. We are still standing." He said, "Every escalation from Moscow is met with determination from Kyiv. This has not changed. This will not change." And he said, "We call on our partners not to falter. Now is not the time for hesitation. Now is the time for unity. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become." Zelensky's speech was broadcast across Ukraine and translated immediately for international audiences. He spoke directly to Russian citizens as well, telling them that their government's actions were leading only to more death, more isolation, and more suffering. It was a speech that balanced defiance with dignity, strength with sorrow, and it reminded the world why Ukraine continues to fight. Section L, expanded threat. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the repositioning of strategic weapons, Belarus conducted unexpected military exercises near the Polish border. Russian naval activity increased significantly in the Baltic Sea. Cyber attacks targeting Ukrainian infrastructure spiked dramatically over the past 48 hours. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Whether this is preparation for a new offensive, an attempt to stretch Ukrainian defenses thin, or simply a coordinated pressure campaign remains unclear. But what is clear is that this was planned, this was coordinated, and this requires a coordinated response. Section M, possibilities. Western analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing a winter offensive, hoping to exploit any slowdown in Western military aid. Another is that Putin is attempting to create conditions for forced negotiations on terms favorable to Russia. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to establish new red lines that normalize Russian aggression at current territorial holdings. But today, Zelensky took that card off the table. Ukraine didn't signal willingness to accept frozen conflict. They didn't show signs of fatigue or desperation. They didn't blink. They struck back. And in doing so, they demonstrated that Ukraine's position remains firm. This war ends with the restoration of Ukrainian territorial integrity, not with Russian occupation locked in place. Section N, the test what we're watching now, is a test of resolve. Putin wants to see if the West will tire before Russia does. Zelensky wants to show that Ukrainian determination is unbreakable. The United States wants to prevent escalation from spiraling into direct NATO-Russia confrontation. And Europe wants to prevent a frozen conflict that leaves a hostile Russia permanently on its doorstep. The stakes could not be higher, and the next few weeks will likely determine the trajectory of this conflict for months to come. Section O, latest updates tonight. We've heard from NATO officials who are now monitoring the situation in real time from Brussels. They say alliance members are in constant communication. They say contingency planning for various scenarios has been updated, and they say Putin's decision to escalate is likely part of a broader pressure strategy intended to fracture Western unity before winter sets in. But Zelensky is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down. Their response today, swift, precise, and devastating to Russian logistics, sent a message to Putin that intimidation will not work, and it sent a message to the West that Ukraine remains a capable and determined partner. Additional reports indicate that Ukrainian forces are preparing for potential follow-up strikes should Russia continue its provocative posturing. This is not a nation waiting for rescue. This is a nation fighting for its survival. Closing as the situation continues to develop, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with this escalation. But what we do know is that the State Department's warning was timely. It reinforced American commitment to Ukrainian sovereignty. It signaled to allies that Washington remains engaged. And it put Moscow on notice that further escalation will not go unanswered. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the coming days. If he backs down, this moment will be remembered as a failed attempt at coercive diplomacy. If he doubles down, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. They have shown that unity is not just a slogan, it is a strategy. Section Q, final hook, and tonight, for the first time in weeks, Moscow appears to be recalculating. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is thinking. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Putin learned something he has been forced to learn repeatedly since February 2022. Ukraine will not break. The West will not abandon its ally. An escalation, rather than achieving Russian objectives, only strengthens the resolve of those who stand against aggression. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Zelensky's call for unity has been heard. The State Department's warning has been delivered, and Ukraine remains standing, defiant, determined, and dangerous to those who underestimate its will to survive. And we will be here, watching every detail, as the next phase of this historic confrontation unfolds.